We are Irish side of the moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish side of the moon.
I still have a dream.
There are many sources of energy available.
Everything is energy. My God, do we need this or what? Free our minds.
Corporations have taken over the world.
Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish side of the moon.
Hello, you're very welcome once again to the Irish side of the moon. This is Michael Leddy at the microphone, as always. If you're a long-time listener to the Irish side of the moon, then you know the score. You know our formula at this stage. The shows are always 80 to 90 minutes long. It's always one guest, and we talk in detail, in great depth, about their background, their message, whether it's a book or a documentary, and we talk about how they do what they do, which fascinates me. I'm always interested in how people do what they do, because we can learn. I really believe we can learn from that. That's the formula, and that's not changing. There are shows there's about 5 shows already recorded that will be appearing as per the normal schedule over the coming weeks and into the coming months, and continue that formula. But I'm interested in expanding the formula and doing a few things now that we have our own dedicated website for the archive, which came online over the last few months in the summer. And one of the ideas I'm looking at is doing shorter shows. For the moment I'm thinking of calling them Lunar Modules. See, Irish side of the moon, Lunar Modules. This is Lunar Module 1, if you like. And the idea is that it will be a shorter show that is recorded and edited and uploaded immediately, which is different to what we normally do. As you know, we keep the shows normally and schedule them and stagger them out and promote them a little bit on Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr is new in the mix. But this is something different. It's, as I say, just reach out to somebody, talk to them for 10 or 15 minutes and upload it. So the idea occurred to me about a week and a half ago. It was kind of going around in my brain. I had seen something online. I thought that would be, a subject maybe. Didn't do anything about it till this week, and then I saw an article that struck several chords. Just one piece, and just in that piece alone you had GMOs, which is something we've dealt with in depth, a couple of guests. We looked, the article talked about newspapers and the bias that some newspapers might have, the power. It makes you think about the power that newspapers have in society, particularly the editorials and the editorial slant, and that chord was struck. Propaganda, the idea of propaganda comes up in this story, and also corporations. So those 4 major chords from this one article, and I thought, okay, that's perfect for starting, for Lunar Module 1 as it was. The article was on a website called gefoodlabels.org, gefoodlabels.org, and the lady who wrote it is Michele Simon. So I reached out to Michele Simon, found out a little bit about her. She has a website called appetiteforprofit.com, and she is a public health lawyer who has been researching and writing about the food industry and food politics since 1996. And she specialises in legal strategies to counter corporate tactics that harm the public's health. Her groundbreaking 2007 report on alcoholic energy drinks led to a federal ban on these dangerous products. She has a book out, Appetite for Profit. It's available through her website. It's available on Amazon. And as I say, her website is also appetiteforprofit.com. She wrote this article on gefoodlabels.org. California newspaper editorial boards spread false claims and faulty logic on Proposition 37. So I thought, let's reach out to Michele. I did, explained what I wanted to do. She was gracious and immediately came on board with the idea of doing a short, quick interview. And I got her on the phone and asked her about Proposition 37, about this editorial bias. And I'm on the line right now with Michele Simon, the author of Appetite for Profit. Michele, thank you very much for joining me on the Irish side of the moon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You came onto my radar. I was on the website gefoodlabels.org. I saw an article that you had written a couple of weeks ago. It struck a couple of chords with me. There was two things that really stood out as subjects that we've dealt with on the Irish Side of the Moon before, and that's why I reached out to you. The first thing is the whole idea of genetically modified organisms. GMOs, that's come up on the Irish Side of the Moon before, and we've spoken to many people with very serious concerns, and that was one of the things that stood out in your article. The other thing that came out was the newspaper editorial bias, and that's another thing that we're very interested in. The newspapers, the power of the mainstream media, and the power of the alternative media as more and more shows like ours and more people turn to blogging as a way to get information out. So they were the two chords that really struck for me personally. The article was about Proposition 37. Can you tell me first and foremost what is Proposition 37? Explain the whole story from your perspective in your own words first.
Well, it was a pretty simple idea. People have been concerned about this technology for many years, and we can argue about whether or not GMOs are good for you, or whether this is a good idea. But the bottom line is consumers have a right to know, and that was the theme of the campaign, to simply allow consumers in the free market to make the choice themselves. And so it would have required foods that contain GMO ingredients to be labeled as such. And in fact, 41 other countries, including the entire European Union, usually you have to say that to an American audience, already does this. So America is lagging behind the rest of the world on this policy. And so it was really a pretty straightforward idea. It's one that we haven't been able to get done anywhere in the United States, of course, thanks to heavy-duty lobbying by the likes of Monsanto. But that was the concept.
Okay, so that was the basic idea, and it's very straightforward, and as you say, it's accepted around the world that consumers can see in various countries what they're buying, and they can see the labels, etc. And the idea was to put that through. It was not successful.
No. Despite early polling, and by the way, just to some polling across the United States has shown something like 90% of Americans are in favor of this concept. Early polling on this particular initiative in California showed something like 66% of Californians thought this was a good idea. But that was before the onslaught of deceptive ads that came down from the opposition. And at the end of the day, the opposition outspent the yes side 5-1. So $45 million war chest fueled deceptive ads that ultimately turned it around, and the final vote was something like 53% no, 47% yes, which is actually pretty good given the fact that the no side engaged in a number of deceptive, dirty tricks. Yeah,
this is what you've talked about. So let's talk about the no side's argument. Let's look at the newspapers first. You mentioned a couple of papers in your piece. To summarize it in my own words, and if I'm incorrect, you can correct me, but the Sacramento newspaper gave the impression that saying yes to this would open the door on countless lawsuits. The LA Times suggested that targeting GMOs was not enough, and therefore there were other things that were more important, and just don't bother with this. And you mentioned three papers then in total that gave the impression that, and I suppose I'll put it this way, the proper procedures hadn't been followed. The people were kind of careless or stupid in putting together Proposition 37, that it wasn't done by the strict legislation of what should be done for certain paperwork like this, and that for those reasons it should be thrown out. So that's essentially what the editorial slant of these papers seems to have been, and it seems to have really shocked you.
Yeah, well, what shocked me was the outright misinformation that so many papers perpetuated. So, first of all, every major newspaper in California, from San Francisco to Los Angeles, recommended a no vote. That was bad enough that they were on the wrong side of the issue. But then the reasons they gave were absurd. You mentioned the LA Times saying, well, there are so many other issues that we need to be worried about. It's like the logic of that really escaped me. Because there's so much wrong with our food supply, we shouldn't take on this one issue. It was really
it doesn't make sense. No, it's an argument that logically doesn't. And you say this in your piece. You're very fair-minded. You do say that, if somebody opposes it and has valid reasons, fair enough. Mm-hmm. But you draw attention to the fact brilliantly, I think, that there doesn't seem to be any valid reasons behind these negative editorials.
And then most disturbing were the several papers that not just said the language was faulty, but actually said that the proponents should have tried going through our state legislature first, when in fact they had. So in other words, these newspapers were actually misinforming their readers by saying, well, we didn't bother to go through the state legislature first. No one takes on a ballot initiative, taking the issue right to the voters before trying the state legislature first, because it's a last resort. It's extremely expensive and labor intensive. So the point is, there were no politicians in our state capital that were brave enough to even take this on, and yet the newspapers said that we didn't try that approach first when we had.
And this is a universal theme, it's a universal concern, because although what you're talking about is very specific to your part of the world, anybody listening to us can relate, because the idea that newspapers might misuse their power and influence, and that might, in their editorials, go the wrong side of an issue for illogical reasons, and yet to the man and woman in the street it might appear that this is a very well put together argument, and that it will ultimately sway voters. That happens around the world. It happens in my part of the world. It's obviously what you're talking about in your part of the world. What can ordinary people in the street do with something like that? Are we at an age where newspapers still have too much control? Do you think the internet is threatening them? Blogs and various websites that can maybe close. What do you think yourself, and where do you think things are going?
Right. Well, I think the argument can be made that in this day and age, newspaper editorials don't have as much sway as they used to. But the problem with how this came down, this is just one of many factors that went to why the measure lost, but the no side was able to quote incessantly from these editorials, and then, of course, make a lot of noise about how they were able to get almost every major newspaper in California, a number of smaller ones, to take their side. So that's how it translates into it's the megaphone effect of how the no side then is able to use it.
And your own website, Appetite for Profit, you put a follow-up article which I read through, and I was reading through the comments on that as well, and there's some great debate going on, some extreme debate in the comment section, and the point being made, some people being very negative about the people in California, but the point you're making is that people are only as good as the information they get, or only as good as the education they have on the matters, and if in some respects that's faulty, then they can't be blamed for we'll say, making an incorrect or possibly wrong vote.
Right. So, what came out after the results were out were a number of people criticizing Californians, especially people who were watching this closely from other parts of the country, and saying, oh, how stupid could Californians be to vote no on this, when clearly this is such a no-brainer. And it really made me sad to see that kind of reaction, and that's why I made sure to point out, we really, and then you're right, people carried on that debate in the comments, which I think is a healthy debate to have, but I think too many people underestimate the power of propaganda, and that's really what we're talking about. When you have $45 million war chest to be able to spend on, pummeling people with ads, and to say that, oh, well, there's, some people on the comments said things like, in this day and age, it's easy to get information. Well, first of all, there's all kinds of confusing information on the internet. Not much of it isn't reliable, especially on this topic. For some reason, tends to bring out all kinds of craziness. So there's that. But the other thing that people outside California don't realize is that we have an extremely complicated voting process because of the initiative process. In other words, Prop 37 wasn't the only thing on the ballot. Obviously we had the presidential election and all of our local races as well, but 37 this year was one of 11 statewide measures, all of them very confusing, many of them put up by corporate interests trying to fool people, and then, of course, a number of local measures. So, to say, oh, well, people just need to get the information, I find it a struggle, to have to sit down and study the night before. It always feels like a big test to understand what these different measures are. So it's understandable that, in that context, that they might get confused. And then the history has shown, too, that when people are confused or just pissed off about so many measures they have to vote on, which many people are in California, they tend to vote no. And so often measures that might, otherwise be popular in concept go down because of it's very difficult to figure out one measure over the other, and so people just vote no.
Yeah, and they just walk away from it. You mentioned a couple of things there. You mentioned propaganda, very, very strong word, and you mentioned corporate interests. And I mean, that's another thing about this story that resonates across many different topics and many different stories that have been covered on the Irish side of the moon. Because in many cases, people with an important message to get out, whether it's about GMOs or something else, are up against corporate interests, are up against big bucks. And you quoted the statistic there, or the fraction 5-1, the difference between the amount of money spent on the corporate side and the amount of money that was available to the other side. In a situation like that, I mean, can you be optimistic about the future? Do you think that what do you think is going to happen in the years ahead? Will the campaign continue? In different states, will people kill? Is there ever hope to win, or what do you honestly think? Do you think is the deck stacked?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to be too gloom and doom here, but
I know it's a tough question.
Yeah. No, of course. The deck is always stacked, right? I mean, there's no question we're up against a monumental challenge with the likes of Monsanto and DuPont, and not to mention PepsiCo and Nestle, and you name your international food conglomerate, they were opposed to this measure. So, but it doesn't mean that all hope is lost. What we have is the truth and the people power on our side. And this issue is definitely not going away. I mean, people were very energized. The volunteers who worked on this campaign, obviously disappointed, but they still got 4.2 million Californians to vote in favor of this measure, despite the $45 million spent against it. So there's a lot of momentum. People are certainly not giving up and moving forward in some other states, and also there's an ongoing national effort to convince our Food and Drug Administration to change its policy, because that's ultimately obviously where this needs to change is at the national level. It's just the politics are even harder there. And so it's a combined effort going forward of state-level action, either through other states that allow ballot measures, taking it right to the people, or through state legislatures, and then combined with this federal effort. And so, I think over time we do have a good chance, but there's no question we need to get smarter, and the movement needs to be better coordinated.
Yeah, that was, and in our closing minutes together, that was something you alluded to as well in another article, the fact that you were saying that some of the fundraising efforts and everything weren't coordinated, and there were things that can be improved, and when that's done, that would give you an optimistic view of the future, because if there were mistakes made that can be corrected, then the next time round, it could go the other way.
Absolutely, and I really do think it's important after a loss like this to take stock and say, okay, what can we learn moving forward? And hopefully the leaders of the campaign will do that and figure out how to improve what we do next time.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a brilliant attitude, and that's one of the messages that I would want to take from this story, and it's something that comes about in various stories we cover on the show, and the various guests say the same thing, that sometimes in a defeat you learn from it and then you regroup, and tomorrow is another day.
Absolutely.
Michele Simon, thank you. I reached out to you, as I said, this is the first of a new venture in terms of doing shorter, more immediate interviews, and hopefully maybe reach out to you again next year and maybe get you back for a full show and talk at length. Would love to do that. AppetiteForProfit.com is the website to find out more about you, your work, and the book is called Appetite for Profit. And again, very gracious of you. I reached out to you, explained that it was a new venture, and you immediately jumped on board, and I appreciate that. And it's been a pleasure. If you have any final words to say about the issue and about the future, anything you think that everyone should know about?
No, I think it's good to look at this issue from an international perspective as well. We Americans tend to forget that there are other countries out there, so any support that we can get internationally would be great as well. So I would say, for people in other parts of the world to be kind of watching what goes on in the U.S. and lending their support and helping with certain talking points, for example, because other countries actually have the experience on this, and also just being aware of the role of the food industry, because this is just one issue that I work on, and to be thinking about how corporations are really wielding its power in all sorts of ways with our food supply, and to get people to think more about that more broadly.
We are Irish side of the moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish side of the moon.
I still have a dream.
This is just a ride. We can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love.
Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish side of the moon.